It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 9. I'm your host, Dr. Joel Duff, and here I take a look at the headlines from Young Earth Creationist websites over the past week. This week we have Flat Earth Refutation, Creation Colleges, Floods Form Fossils Fast, and Creationist at a Geology Conference. Danny Faulkner at Answers in Genesis has published his third installment of a refutation of flat Earth ideas. And in this case, he's calling it the scientific method in flat Earth. And what he's addressing is how flat earthers, in his mind, misuse the scientific method. It's a really good article. I've said this about the last two set parts of this series. Over the past year, he's published these 3 different articles refuting flat Earth ideas. And as I've noted before, the reason why this became necessary, I would say most young Earth creationist organizations have ignored flat earthers for quite a while. But you may know that flat Earth has gained a little bit of traction, and most importantly, it's gained quite a bit of traction within the young Earth creationist community. And I don't mean the leaders of the young Earth creationist community. I mean the followers of young Earth creationist material have fallen prey to flat Earth arguments, partly because some of those arguments are fairly similar to those that young Earthers use. Um, but nonetheless, Danny Faulkner and Answers in Genesis have found it necessary to refute these ideas that many of their followers have been falling into. Um, Flat Earth is not synonymous with young Earth creationism. I want to make sure you understand that. There are many people who believe in a flat Earth that are certainly not young Earth creationists. So it's not synonymous with, say, biblical creation or biblical ideas. Nonetheless, the style of argumentation, and there are ways to read the scripture that would lend support to the idea of a flat Earth. And so some like ultra literalists of the Bible, not just the literalist of young Earth creationism, but those who are even more literal with the text, can fall into the idea that the Bible actually teaches a flat Earth. And so Answers in Genesis has put Danny Faulkner onto spending some time to refute these ideas. And as I said before, I think Danny Faulkner's done a wonderful job. I really have to commend his series. It's articulate. There's sound reasoning in his arguments. I mean, if you want to find a refutation of flat Earth, I don't mind at all pointing to his work here. And so I really appreciate the fact that I can point to Answers in Genesis website and say, here's a good article. You should read this, if a flat earther comes along. And in some ways, reading a young Earth creationist refuting flat Earth is much more powerful and maybe useful if you're working with a flat earther, than maybe say an atheist that's refuting flat Earth, right? Somebody within that community saying, here's what's wrong with this particular line of thought can be a much more powerful witness to that and more effective. So he talks a lot about the scientific method, and I think what he has to say here is quite good. He's actually defending a broader view of the scientific method than the flat earthers use. They have I think they do have a misconception or misuse the scientific method. And Danny Faulkner's exactly right. What I find fascinating about Faulkner's arguments is that at the same time he's making these arguments about a flat Earth, I don't know if he realizes that many of the things he says are things that I and others would apply to young Earth creationism in terms of their own misuse of the scientific method. It's like I wish they would turn around and look at it and inspect their own literature and ask, aren't we doing the same things in some areas? There is one sad postscript to this, which I just discovered the day after I was thinking about talking about this, and that is that Rob Skiba has died just recently, last week, succumbed to a long battle with COVID-19. Ron Skiba is probably one of the most prominent flat Earth promoters. Large YouTube station. Danny Faulkner actually got to know Rob Skiba, and really his articles that are refuting a flat Earth are in response to some of his conversations with Rob. And I just want to say I appreciate Faulkner's response to his death. He wrote a short blog piece on the Answers in Genesis website, reporting the death of flat earther Rob Scaba. And as he and I think I think this is a commendable way to approach the death of somebody who you disagreed with, right? As he said, he's a gentleman. This is proof that people can disagree without being disagreeable. He enjoyed his time discussing this topic with him. And he rightly calls out those who have been rude and made comments on the internet about his passing, and used it basically as a political, his death as to make their political points without recognizing him as a person. And I was convicted by Danny Faulkner's approach here. And all right, sticking with Answers in Genesis, let's move to a little conference they've got coming up. They've got their Creation College Expo, which they put on every year. And so they bring in high school students, it used to be the Creation Museum. I believe they're at the Art Encounter now in their new facility. They have a little conference over the weekend. They have these talks, but most importantly, they have representatives from various colleges that are creation friendly, right? And they're trying to promote the idea that you can't just go to a Christian college. You need to go to a creation, a young earth creation friendly college, because they're the only ones that have the correct view. However, just look at this list of speakers and what their topics are. All right, they're going to kick it off with Brian Osborne, an AIG speaker, a biblical response to social justice and critical race theory. Right, and then Ken Ham's going to talk about parenting kids in the face of giants. All right, well, that's the giants are the tech companies and the world out there, right? That's out to get everybody. And then Ken Ham comes back the next day and talks about culture and chaos and the conflicted church, and is going to excoriate the church for not, preaching young earth creationism, which would solve most of our problems, according to him. I show this because Answers in Genesis is really a culture wars apologetics ministry. It's sort of at its core creation science, because that's where it kind of started with Genesis and the questions about science and faith. But that's never was Ken Ham's real true love. His true love really is Christian apologetics writ large, and mostly, the us against them, culture war mentality is his whole approach. And what he's saying is that having the right position on Genesis will lead you to the right positions on hundreds of other issues, right? But he's more interested in actually talking about those other issues. And so he's promoting colleges that, say if you could find a college that teaches the right view of creation, young earth creation, typically they're going to also have in his mind the right views of these other topics like social justice and critical race theory. And so they're pushing colleges that teach creation science at their core, and that more importantly, not just in their science departments, but they're really interested in whether their theology or religion departments also are pushing young earth creationism, because that's going to infuse the rest of the curriculum, right, with this literalistic young earth view of not just science, but of other issues, such as critical race theory and social justice. Now, Answers in Genesis used to maintain, and they're going to have colleges there represented, and I know that they're going to talk about here are the best ones to go to. They used to maintain a page in which they had their highest recommended colleges, and then they had sort of like their secondary colleges that weren't quite fully, like totally on board with young earth creationism. And I've been looking for that page and I can't find it, so it doesn't seem to be there anymore. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the number of colleges that they fully commit to is gotten rather slim, because a couple of them have fallen off, because they haven't been as committed as Answers in Genesis would like them to be. And so now they just have this general sort of like, here's ones we sponsor. But over on the New Creation blog, sponsored by Is Genesis History, they had a fairly recent article, Creation College is What You Need to Know by Sarah Ann, And she talks about the differences between creation colleges and how committed they are to young Earth creationism. And then at the bottom, they do have a list of creation affirming institutions, and all they have is six, right, of them. You have Cedarville University, which is here in Ohio, and I'm quite familiar with. And they have a geology degree, which is explicitly a creation science degree. They have biology, molecular biology, and even in their physics department and so forth. But all these departments would have committed young Earth creationists. But you would especially see that maybe in the biology and geology departments in terms of the training you get. And in a few minutes, we're going to see Dr. Whitmore, who's a professor there, and his work from Cedarville University. And of course, you have Liberty University, which I think Answers in Genesis actually has dropped from their highest recommended list because although they have many creation scientists there and some of their science departments have creation scientists in them, I don't believe that the whole university itself is as committed to creation science as Answers in Genesis would like them to be, especially some people in the religion department, and that makes Answers in Genesis a little skeptical of Liberty University, that they may be sliding, and becoming more liberal, as crazy as that might sound. And then you got Masters University. Yeah, where's my Masters University out in California, Bryan College down in Tennessee, Calvary University, and Bob Jones University, which is probably one of the better known older colleges. And some of these have fairly, well, Liberty University especially has a very large student population. Nonetheless, that's not a lot of choices if you are a young Earth creationist and you want to go to, and you're a parent and you want to send your child to a full orbed young Earth creationist institution that will not only teach young Earth creationism, but all the things that flow out from that are things that Ken Ham believes you should also believe about all the other types of social issues as well. Okay, let's go to Institute for Creation Research. And they have a short little blurb on the front page. Actually, it says September 30th, but it was highlighted more recently on their website. And Creation Kids, floods form fossils fast. And so this is just a kid's worksheet. And it just caught my eye for a couple reasons, and I want to say a couple words about it. Here we say, do you know that fossils almost never form today? Interesting observation. Fossils almost never form today. You might have heard that fossils formed over millions of years, but actually fossils can form in a very short period of time under the right conditions. Let's just analyze these couple sentences, but I'm going to do that on the next page. This is actually their little worksheet that you can print out and give to your kids at home while they're doodling. Floods form fossils fast. Did you know that fossils almost never form today? Okay, you know, that's a statement that is true in the broad sense of there are trillions of organisms, and when those trillion organisms die each day, the vast majority of them will never become fossilized, right? And so they're not denying that fossils don't happen. And then they go on to say, well, most things get decay, and they only turn to fossils if they're buried quickly in mud, right? So you might have heard that fossils formed over millions of years, but actually fossils can form in a very short period of time under the right conditions. And of course, what are those conditions according to this particular little worksheet for kids? Well, the only conditions are the worldwide flood, or at least you're given that impression. The worldwide flood formed fossils that we see today because they can bury things very quickly and therefore create fossils very fast. I just want to interject here that that a flood provides a wonderful opportunity to start the first stage of fossilization, but it isn't actually the end product of fossilization that results from a flood. It's not like something gets trapped under a lot of mud and then it instantly is a fossil. After all, there's been floods, documented floods from 3,000 years ago where you can go into the material that was laid down by that flood, dig it up, and the things you find in there are not fossils, at least not fossils in the sense that the material of the organic material of what was contained there has been turned into rock, all right, or replaced by minerals and so forth, right? So That takes a considerable amount of time in many cases. There are some situations where fossilization process can actually occur fairly quickly. And so within hundreds of years or thousands of years, you can develop what we might call a fossil. Um, but the flood itself just creates the conditions that may allow fossilization to happen. And that sounds like I'm just being nitpicky, but it's really important to remember because if you just think that a flood makes fossils, then it becomes easy to believe that, oh, we have a global flood, well, that created all these fossils. But I want to bring you back to something else I've said a couple times in past episodes. You have to remember that in ICR, you know, this is just a kid's thing. So they're not going to get really down in the weeds and sophisticated here. And I understand they're being very general, but I don't even think they think about these things when they write them. They believe that the top portion of the fossil record, the last couple million years worth of fossil record, is laid down after the flood during post-flood events. There are billions and billions and billions of fossils in those rocks that they consider to have occurred after the flood. And so any indication that a worldwide flood is needed to make fossils, certainly not necessary because in their own presentations, they show a large portion of the fossil, or well, and for ICR, not a large portion, but some portion of the fossil record was formed under non-worldwide flood conditions. So, you know, volcanoes and other local floods creating fossils in the more recent past. So fossils can form in floods, but a lot of fossils in the fossil record don't necessitate a global flood. A global flood might create the conditions in which fossilization can occur, but local floods can also do that too. And does it require a long period of time? Yeah. I mean, if everything had been buried just 4,000 years ago, we wouldn't have all the fossils we have today. We'd have things that are in the process of being fossilized. Because, as I just said before, fossilization is not an instantaneous process. It's not like the flood is fossilization. No, the flood is the first part of a process, the first stage of the process of fossilization. Geologists or creationists go to a geology meeting and present. The Geological Society of America, their 2021 conference, right? Scientific conference met just recently this past week. And there were three abstracts presented there, three posters presented there. So now I've seen several people reference the fact that Young Earth Creationists presented at a geology conference. And I think some people, if they don't know anything about those conferences, might get the misimpression that presentation sounds like an oral presentation, like they're standing up in front of an audience and they're a featured speaker or something like that, right? They're presenting their work. And this what it actually means is they presented a poster. And I don't want to demean presenting posters. I've presented posters at meetings, and I have students who present posters at scientific meetings. What this is you have a poster that represents your work, and then there is usually a large ballroom, and there'll be hundreds, and in the case of GSA, there's literally hundreds of posters in rows. And then you would stand in front of your poster and people can walk by and they can read your poster and then you're there to answer questions and talk about what you've learned. And so I go there and I wander around and I have the list of abstracts and I ask myself like what things do I want to know more about, and I want to meet this particular author and I get to talk to them and so forth. And so I'll sort of schedule out my time and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to poster number 105 and then 207 and then 302, and I have a certain agenda, right? And so they are presenting in the sense that they are presenting on a poster the information. And for most conferences, this isn't hard to get into. They probably had to submit an abstract that had to be approved. And so these are the abstracts that I'm showing you of these talks or of these presentations. Nonetheless, you've got several young Earth creationists who have gone to the Geological Society of America and they have presented their work there. And what is all that work about? All right, so I'm going to read you the three different abstracts, the titles of the abstracts. Here's paper 2815, characterizing variation among prints interpreted as raindrop impressions in the Permian Coconino sandstone in northern Arizona. And this is by Leonard Brand and Sarah Mathiel at Loma Linda University, a Seventh-day Adventist creationist leaning college or university, and the aforementioned John Whitmore at Cedarville University, one of those fully committed young earth creationist colleges. And he leads the geology department there at Cedarville University. Here's another paper, a comparison of dip angles from ancient cross-bedded sandstones and modern aeolian dunes. Aeolian means wind produced or under air dunes rather than underwater. And so this I think is the most important abstract. I'll come back to that in a moment, and that is by John Whitmore, part of a long series of experiments he's done on the Coconino and other sandstones. And thirdly, experimental trackways of scorpions, tarantulas, and crayfish under subaerial and subaqueous conditions. So that means under the air and under the water. So what do tracks look like on sand made by a walking scorpion that's walking underwater versus walking on the land, and then how might those be preserved and what might they look like in the fossil record? What do all three of these have in common? They do have a common theme. The common theme here is here's this article by John Whitmore in Answers in Genesis a few years back. Coconino sandstone, the most powerful argument against the flood. All right, so the Coconino sandstone is a large block of sandstone that's found in the Grand Canyon, but also across a large area of the West, responsible for a lot of the red rock that you see out there. And it's been interpreted by secular geologists as being the result of massive sand dunes long ago in the past. And those massive sand dunes are then preserved, and that's what we're seeing as those rocks today. Well, massive sand dunes that were formed in a desert-like condition don't really fit with a global flood, since all of these rocks, by all young Earth creationist measures of where the global flood occurred and what rocks are in the global flood, they all consider these to be part of what happened during a global flood. So it's hard to imagine how a global flood would deposited massive subaerial sand dunes. That seems like a really powerful argument against the flood, right? And so it's going to be really necessary for creationists to find some way to wiggle out of this particular apparent perceived problem with the global flood. And John Whitmore in this article, goes down one after another and talks about why this isn't a problem. And in fact, it's a problem for the secular scientists, because really these things were laid down under subaqueous conditions, and really tries to make a strong argument for that. So these three presentations given this year are all part of a series of research experiments that these scientists have performed to try to show that some of the reasons why scientists believe that these are sand dunes that are under subaerial conditions, that were deposited under subaerial conditions, might in fact not be under subaerial conditions, but could have been made underneath the water. So these great huge waves, and you could have had sand, because sand does form, off of the coasts in the ocean, and there are a form of sand dune underneath the ocean. So they're saying that. But what about fossilized prints of raindrops that have been suggestive even in the Coconino sandstone? What about fossilized footprints of various insects that appear to be things like a tarantula? How could they have been formed underneath the water? And that's why they're trying to show that possibly they could have been formed underwater. Here's an interesting website. It's a Dutch website, creationist site, oorsprong.info by Jan Vermeerten. And oorsprong translates roughly into origin or origins. And he covers creation stories from this Dutch perspective. And he actually talks about, as you can see here, he's telling his audience, new research by creationists presented at Geological Society of America conference, right? See, creationists do legitimate research and present them at secular conferences, and he covers the three different things that they say. Now, if you want to know what I think about this, I don't have any problem with them presenting these posters at GSA. And I read all three abstracts, and they're very reasonable. And I don't have any reason to doubt the data that they present. They don't present a creationist perspective. They simply present the data, the facts. Here are things we did, the observations we made, and they do actually suggest that the literature may need to be reread in terms of like how we understand some of these impressions. And that's nothing, there's nothing wrong with that, right? You make your argument, and then you see how others respond, and we'll see if that has any impact on the literature of the coconino sandstone in the future. I do want to go right to the one which I think is the most important about inclination angles, because I've heard about this over and over and over again about how the inclination angles, and I've been at creationist talks where they talk about the coconino sandstone, and they talk about how the inclination angles are wrong for sand dunes that are subaerially deposited, and these fossilized sand dunes have inclination angles that suggest they're actually laid down underneath water and not under the air. And they make it sound as if that has to be the case. But what's fascinating about the abstract is the abstract doesn't really come to that particular conclusion. The conclusion it can comes from is significantly less clear. Okay, so here's what they say, and this is Van Meerten actually summarizing it. The outcome of the study was that the slope angles of the crossbeds of ancient sandstone, so that would be the angle of which the sand is going downhill down the side of a sand dune, clusters between 15.5 and 24 degrees. So how steep can your sand dune be, really, is the question, and almost never exceeds 30 degrees. So they studied crossbeds and ancient sands. They measured these angles of the direction of the sandstone lines are following in many different places, in many different kinds of sandstones, not just in the coconino sandstone. And they found a wide variety of different angles, whereas modern aeolian deposits, aeolian would be wind dispersed or under air deposits, the slope is more dispersed, clustering between 9 and 27 degrees, but also contains values above 30 degrees. It was striking, no difference was visible between the sandstones, the coconino sandstone, Tapete sandstone, and the Wescogame sandstone. I don't know if you noticed what I noticed, but the range of cross-bedding in modern versus ancient sandstones, there's pretty much an overlap between the two. I'm just saying there's more diversity among modern ones than there are against ancient sandstones. But nonetheless, the ancient ones fit within the modern parameters. So in other words, there's no data here that says that those sandstones had to have been formed underneath water. All they can say is that it could have been made underwater. In other words, their data suggests, based on the angles of inclination, suggests that it could have been made underwater, but it also could have been made under the air. It doesn't exclude the idea that it's made under the air. And if you go to a creation conference, sometimes you'll get the feeling that they've excluded that possibility. But when you read the abstract where they're just divulging the actual data they collected, it doesn't really say that. So all the best that they've done is they've just made it sort of like, oh, we can't tell. Just looking at the inclination angles, you can't really tell whether it was subaerial or subaqueous, under the water or under the air. So we need to find other ways to maybe determine whether it's under the air or under the water. Hence those other studies, arthropods and other things, and footsteps and rain print stops. So you need to cast, if we can cast doubt on all those things, then maybe you at least have a reason to believe it could have been underneath the water. But that accomplishes their mission, because otherwise the global flood is not going to work, right? Because if it clearly is not underneath the water, then all hope is lost, because these are massive deposits of sand. And if they were deposited all underneath subaerial conditions, there couldn't have been a global flood at that particular time. So that's why that particular work is very important for young Earth creationists. They have to have um, they have to at least create the possibility that their position is viable. And this is why they continue to write about it. This is why they continue to discuss it and research it, is to give their audience at least a hope that they'll find evidence um, that continues to support the possibility of a global flood. Okay, so that's this week in creationism. There was a lot going on, and I've seen a whole lot of other articles and things I would like to talk about, but I didn't want to make this too long. It's already too long. In the future, I'm trying to squeeze this down into like maybe quicker highlights of a bunch of things, and then maybe focus on one thing to discuss in more detail. But the idea is to give you kind of a lay of the land of the issues in creationism and where creationists are placing their energy, what is their focus, and by seeing the headlines each week over time, you kind of develop an idea of sort of where creationism is heading in the future and what their concerns are. All right, that's it me for this week. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk to you next time on This Week in Creationism.